Hello and welcome to Caesar and Sartre, where two scholars talk at the intersection of their fields, classics and philosophy. I'm Audra,
At will.
and today we are going to be talking about ancient comedy, which is one of Will's current specialties. Um, so yeah, and I haven't done a lot of reading in ancient comedy, but I have taken a philosophy of humor class, so I might throw some of that out there here and there in the conversation. Um, the thing I was thinking just before I hit the recording button, um, I won't subject you to another song like I did last time. I limit my torture devices. Um, but if anyone hasn't heard the really good a philosopher song from Monty Python, that's some really high, really high quality comedy right there. Like I can recite most of it from memory, I think. Immanuel Kant was an old pissant who was very rarely stable. Heidegger was a boozy beggar who could drink you under the table. David Hume could outconsume good old Friedrich Hegel. And Wittgenstein was a beery swine who's just as sloshed as Schlegel. Like, it's really good. So I recommend listening to that. That's my intro into the glorious world of comedy and humor.
It's actually good that you start there because, of course, all of ancient drama and the comedy in particular is both very poetical and very musical. Um, where does one start? So, um, the very early beginnings of comedy are kind of not super clear. Um, we know that it uh, uh, was started probably not long after the institution of democracy in Athens, with the establishment of the official date is aligned with the establishment of the Dionysian ritual, or the festival of Dionysus, which for those who did not watch our videos on uh, Nietzsche recently, of course, Dionysus is associated with uh, wine drinking and revelry and orgies and all sorts of chaos. And so um, Dionysian ritual tended to be pretty chaotic, um, but and the myth is not coming to me at the moment. But there was a belief in Athens that part of appeasing Dionysus required theater. So the older form of theater is, of course, tragedy, which itself is largely derived from epic. Um, so you get uh, people like Aeschylus who produced. I mean, I'm trying to think of the number. I want to say it's like 90 some tragedies
He
he's
wrote a
believed
lot
to
of
have
plays.
produced. Um, I'm always skeptical of these numbers, and I always will be. But supposedly produced some 90 some plays. I think Sophocles produced over 100, um, and then as those two kind of faded into the background, Euripides, who becomes relevant for our story later, is he himself produced, I think, like 70 some. So he was pretty prolific. And there's a lot of change happens over the course of the development of tragedy. Aeschylus is known both by the ancients and his contemporaries, as well as scholars today, for being some of the hardest Greek basically ever produced. He bends and twists language in ways that you could like not even imagine. It's mind melting to read. It's beautiful, beautiful stuff. Reading sections of his Agamemnon was very, very pleasant. He's got such a way with words, but sometimes he's also just like not comprehensible, and apparently wasn't to many of his contemporaries either. Not least of which, of course, because this is all being produced, for the stage rather than for scholars to read and pick apart. This is a relevant feature of theater that I will keep harping on, but the experience of reading things like on paper is, of course, not really all that similar to listening to something as it is spoken. And there's a lot of confusion and problems that result from this, which we will get into. Drama was actually not performed until, was not published as books until around the late 400s BC. Until that point, it was experienced by, aside from by like actors, was experienced entirely as a thing you watch.
I did have a question.
Yeah.
I read somewhere, I think it was in like Will Durant's history, that Seneca, the philosopher Seneca, that there's some chatter among scholars that some of a lot of the plays he wrote were meant to be read rather than performed. Is that true?
Who
or
is
no?
this? Sorry.
Seneca.
This is an ongoing debate in scholarship that'll probably never be resolved. I actually, having read a little bit of Seneca, Seneca's not even close to my main field of interest, but I poked around a little bit. And his Latin does not seem like insanely difficult or anything. A lot of it's very intelligible. His most memorable line is probably from the Medea, "Nunc sum Medea." Now I am Medea, which is an awesome line. Like Medea's, like she's been having this like ongoing internal monologue, like arguing with herself on the stage for quite a while over whether or not she should kill Jason's children, which is just it's awesome. And then she like becomes like evil devil woman, and like because Medea by this point is like synonymous with witchcraft and an empowered woman. There's so many different like associations of the Roman mind with Medea, and she says "Nunc Medea sum," like I have become Medea. It's very cool. But anyway, but yeah, I don't know. I haven't dug too deep into the philology on that or anything, but I don't know. I do remember one time one of my professors, I was in his class, and like we were about to do something with Seneca, and I just asked, I was like, just rattling off the top of my head, because I was like, now Seneca's stuff, it's not supposed to be like it wasn't supposed to have been performed, right? At least in antiquity. And he was like, well, that's the textbook answer. He looked very miffed about it. I was like, I'm
Okay,
sorry,
there's still some debate on whether or not Seneca's
it's
okay.
We'll probably never know for sure. We don't have any extant references to it being performed in antiquity, but that doesn't mean it wasn't. So I don't know. It does seem odd to me that we don't have any, since we have lots of references to plays, ones that we have and ones that we don't have, being performed and like what they were like. So it's really hard to say.
Okay,
is the answer there. But regardless, but yeah. But regardless, it's not even produced as books at all until the late 400s BC. So like until that point, like as far as we know, it was being entirely experienced on the stage, usually for one day, and then sometimes they would have revival performances, sometimes they would re-perform stuff, but generally speaking, it's supposed to be only performed one day for the Dionysia of one year. So Of course, it starts out with tragedy. You get people like Aeschylus. Aeschylus is known for being very complicated, very tough, even to read, let alone to hear spoken. Sophocles is probably somewhere in the middle. I will admit to not having read really any Sophocles, not really. Um, and then Euripides, who is he has an interesting reputation,
I was told
but
that he
he's
was
generally
not popular, that his plays weren't popular at the time. That he was allowed into the.
that's not true. That's
Okay.
not true.
Okay.
His plays were often seen as inferior by like critics to those of like Aeschylus and others. But no, I don't think there's really a reason to believe that his plays generally weren't popular. Some of them he didn't win prizes for, but I mean that just goes for any tragedian. That's another feature.
That's what I mean.
That's another feature of the Dionysia that's really important. Is that there's prizes at stake. So generally speaking, your plays are comprised of you have you. It's really hard to speak about this broadly because it changes a lot over time. But you have in tragedy at least you have at first it's only one actor and then later there's others and then the chorus, and that's like the beginning of tragedy. At first there was actually no actors and then and just a chorus, which I cannot imagine was the most entertaining thing to watch. But pretty quickly a professional actor was added, and then over time the role of the actor came to supersede that of the chorus. But initially and throughout a lot of and the role of the chorus was very important, and it tended to be more important than the actors, especially in comedy as it developed, which until relatively late. So you get characters like I don't know what I was saying, but yeah. So a lot of early tragedy and then comedy is like the interaction between the actors who are individuals within the story, and then the chorus, which kind of represents in the context of the play, it can be any number of different groups of people, but it generally represents a perceived an understood view of the audience. The reason for that being the actors are professionals, but the chorus, these are people who are in the chorus, are actually just citizens who are selected to do it. And it was a high honor to get to participate. And at first, the competition is primarily between different choruses, each represented by a choregos, a leader of the chorus. And they're competing for a ivy crown, very much like a Roman laurel, from like an athletic competition. It looks very similar. But yeah, they're competing for these ivy crowns, which are often associated with thespians today. But they train of thought.
So when the chorus, when the actor became more important and on top of the chorus, was the chorus like? Was their function almost like the perspective of the everyman, or?
Again, it really depends from play to play. It's hard to speak about in super broad strokes because it changes a lot from play to play. Different authors tend to be quite different too. But yeah, that's a simple way of understanding it. Yeah, like they were often they were constructed so as to be very identifiable to the audience. They're kind of you. Yeah, that's a good way of understanding it, I think. And so they would oftentimes be directly addressing the audience, which this becomes an important feature of comedy later on because comedians love to make their choruses directly address the audience and tell them, "Hey, you all should like vote for this play," which is and the jokes surrounding this become more and more elaborate as time goes on. It's good fun.
Choruses would also be
but
commenting on the story itself, right?
yes,
Sometimes,
yeah. And it's interesting. There's a lot of discussion now over the past couple of decades about like meta theatricality. That is, fourth wall breaking, that sort of thing. The characters in the play understanding the play as a play, and being able to interact with it in that way. And it's interesting because really the idea of a fourth wall doesn't develop until really late in the sort of in the development of theater. Up until I suppose the like late 400s, most choruses were constantly speaking directly to the audience. Sometimes they would address particular individuals in the audience. It's really quite fascinating. Because now we think of theater like, oh, there's what's happening on the stage is not real and it's completely separate from what we're viewing, right? And it's like really weird and jarring to us whenever characters will break out of character and be like, hey, audience member, you, and like that sort of thing. That's really weird to us, but to them that was the norm.
The phrase is often, I think, attributed to Denis Diderot, an 18th century French philosopher who was also like a playwright and like a critic of drama. And he said, the actors and writers should imagine a huge wall across the front of the stage, separating you from the audience, and behave exactly as if the curtain had never risen.
Diderot. I didn't expect to hear that name in this discussion, but makes some kind of sense.
Yeah, he was a big. He wrote a lot about theater. I think he wrote a feminist.
Yeah, a lot of the philosophers did.
He wrote a famous essay called "The Paradox of the Actor," in which he's trying to like elaborate on what he thinks the best actor, how do you become a good actor, and what are the intricacies of that. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's good. One of these days, that'll be a good topic, meta theater, because it's interesting in the ancient context, I think. And I vehemently disagree with Mr. Diderot on this, by the way. I think extreme meta theatricality produces some of the most interesting works of ancient theater. The Pseudolus, for example, of Plautus, which I'm sure we will talk about before this is over. But
I feel like Diderot was probably, he was coming off of the neoclassical like French tragedies, which were very like rule based and
right, yes, which is ironic because it represents a pretty bad misunderstanding. It's neoclassical, but it represents a tremendous misunderstanding of classical theater as it was produced and performed. Anyway, I understand where he's coming from. I have to disagree with him because I love meta theatricality. It's very interesting for all kinds of reasons.
Diderot was critical of the neoclassical French tragedy. Personally, he was kind of he was someone who advocated, I think, for what they called the bourgeois drama. That was, fewer rules, more sentimentality. But anyway, I was drawing the context. His contemporary Voltaire, of course, was a big writer of neoclassical verse tragedies, and that was sort of what an 18th century Frenchman would like think of as like proper theater. Anyway, go ahead.
No, you're good. Now where comedy actually like comes into play is not super clear. One of the more prevalent theories is that it develops out of what is called the satyr play, a third kind of theater that didn't really survive. Like we have like text of it, some fragments and things, but like it didn't really catch on in other contexts it's I think just because it's so highly contextual to the Dionysia, basically the idea is tragedy, maybe because it's so sad often, and it can be rather let down to watch people like commit incest, eat people and stuff. That can really bring your day down. So after tragedies, Dionysus ordered that there be like a sort of para tragedy. And that's what satyr plays sort of do. They uh, represent what would be a generally a like mythological tragic subject, and they do it in a semi-comic way. Um,
Is
they,
satyr where the term satire comes from?
is it? I think so. Yes, I believe so. Yeah. Um, but I could be mistaken on that. It's interesting you bring that up because satire is actually a specifically Roman kind of theater, or at least according to Quintilian, and he's really our only source on that. Um, we can't really know for sure, but satire, like as a distinct genre, didn't exist outside of Rome. It's believed to have been invented in the Roman space. Um, uh, but yeah, so anyway, yeah, but comedy is thought maybe to have developed out of the satyr play. Satyrs, by the way, for those who don't know, are like half human, half goat creatures. And in most of the satyr plays, as I understand, the chorus is supposed to be made up of satyrs. Um, they're like dressed up as satyrs, which is fun. Um, but as the satyr play or whatever becomes as comedy comes about, certain trends evolve out of it, evolve as part of it. There tend to be very ridiculous costumes, uh, and I don't mean that from a modern perspective. The ancients would have seen them as such as well. Very Dionysian. they they tended to involve uh, like prosthetic, distended big bellies, um, for certain characters, especially. But generally, they would make characters look very fat, and male characters would have um, these prosthetic penises, phalluses that would hang off of their suits. I know it's insane to imagine, and every piece of ancient comedy that you're reading gets so much funnier when you imagine that. There's so much humor that we now understand in the dialogue that does not make sense when you don't understand. Oftentimes the statements will make sense, so like philologists would just read over it and not think about it. But once we realized that they were that the ancient audience is seeing these people with giant penises hanging off of them, many jokes make a lot more sense. um, uh, but yeah, there's that going on. Um, and so characters that they have like these big padded bodysuits that tend to like big legs and bellies. They all look very 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 silly, and in the as you this is what we call old comedy. There's three divisions of comedy: old, middle, and new, in the Greek world, and it's kind of those divisions are not really super useful, but they can be helpful in a very broad sense. So I'll use them here. The ancients used them sometimes, and we kind of just adopted them. But like as scholarship looks into it more, it's like, eh. But old comedy is generally known for being it's ischrologic. That is to say, it's filled with bad saying. That meaning both like filthy language, and also like specific personal insult. That's everywhere, especially against. And this becomes more important as the genre develops. political figures. And this, I think, is where an understanding of Athenian democracy is really important. You get because so much of it gets focused around like individuals in a way that politics really weren't ever before. And it makes sense to like because every citizen man is involved in the political process in some way. They that's like on their mind. So you get all kinds of political humor, and like that persists even beyond the death of democracy in Athens, but less so to a great degree, and we'll talk about that as we go along. But especially,
oh, sorry.
Oh, you're good.
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead here. What stage of development was Aristophanes at?
I knew you were going to ask that. Aristophanes is basically the high point, what we think of as the high point of old comedy.
Okay.
Old comedy, it kind of starts out, it's very, like the early beginnings of it are very murky. There's a few names we know of some comedians, but we know basically nothing about what they wrote. Nothing survives. Maybe because it wasn't very good. a lot of ancient texts are like that, where it's like, probably didn't make it because it just wasn't that good. But it's hard to say. But what we do know is that there's what we call the mythological burlesque, where much like in a satyr play, which is part of, I think, the reason that there's a prevalent belief that the satyr play kind of preceded comedy. But mythological burlesques, which are like, stories from recognizable myth to any Greek, get parodied in silly ways. Like there's one, I'm trying to think of what it's called, like Odysseus and his friends, and it's about Odysseus escaping Polyphemus, but it's done in like a ridiculous way, and things like that. It's hard to say exactly. I mean, very little of this stuff survives. Aristophanes is the only old comic poet that made it in any.
Oh, really?
Okay. Well, we have fragments of a lot of people, but often very fragments. Like they're very tiny, very hard to pull a whole lot out of. Aristophanes is the only one with full plays. And there's actually a lot of full Aristophanes plays that made it for one reason or another. He was apparently understood by the ancients as the best of the old comics at all. So it makes some kind of sense that he made it. But
the way you were describing old comedy made me think of Aristophanes. Like,
that's why.
I know he has this one play, and I forget the name of it. You probably know. I think like the women of Athens like take over for a day or something.
Lysistrata. Wait, no, that's not. There's a lot of plays that he does about women taking over stuff, but it sounds like Lysistrata.
But I remember reading it. I remember reading sections of it in college and like watching a bit of a performance of it on YouTube, and it's like pretty filthy.
Oh yeah,
that's not a criticism.
That sounds like Lysistrata. Yeah, Lysistrata. Yeah, it's fucking vile, and I love it. it's depraved.
It's
the very first scene. Oh yeah. The very first scene, people are making jokes about like shaking ass and dildos and all kinds of stuff. It's phenomenal opening. Oh, it's beautiful. It's honestly one of my favorite like introductions to a play. Period. It's just great. Like, the Greek is terribly funny. There's all sorts of and another feature of especially old comedy that you see in Lysistrata is there's a lot of jokes about regions of Greece. Lots of jokes about how the Boeotians are Hicks, the Spartans. For some reason, Athenians seem to find this dance that the Spartans did very, very funny. It's called the kick dance, where they like you kick your butt, which like this is apparently extremely funny to Athenians. personally, I'm like, okay. I mean, I guess butts are kind of funny, but like, I don't know, like kicking your glute, like that's funny. Like, I don't know. Must have. I feel like there's some cultural context that's lost there. Of course, Athens and Sparta had an ongoing rivalry since basically forever. So that's that's yeah, sure. But regardless, yeah. So you get a lot of very personal and like regional humor. This is all sort of the foundations of what makes old comedy old comedy. Um,
So one
the
of
very
the
old. Hmm,
sorry, I hate to keep interrupting you. You just make
it's
me
fine.
think of things. The of course you know this already as well, but you mentioned the personal. One of the personalities that Aristophanes attacked, of course, was Socrates
Yeah, yeah. Although
in the
less
in
than a
the
lot of
cloud.
people seem to think. But yeah, yes, in clouds especially, yes, Socrates is the subject of ridicule. Definitely, yeah. Um, and it's really not clear what Aristophanes' point is with this, if there is any. It may just be Socrates is an identifiable figure for any Athenian because he had a habit of hanging out in the agora and harassing people with annoying questions, which got him killed eventually.
So I
Um,
was under the impression that I mean, you might know better than I, or maybe this just isn't entirely known by scholars, but I was under the impression that Aristophanes was like critical of kind of uh, Socrates as a figure in that he kind of undermined, I guess, the traditional way of life in Athens. I don't know
that
if this is
is
fair, but I've heard it like in a weird way. I've heard Aristophanes described as, despite as filthy as he is, like he's still adhering to kind of traditional values and still promoting traditional values.
I think trying to assign a political ideology to anything Aristophanes does is very difficult to impossible. He's I don't really think there's any reason to read into him as like some kind of reactionary or anything. I think that's kind of a scholarly invention without a lot of backing. Now, I'm not an Aristophanes scholar, so people much smarter than me disagree with me on that. It's whatever. He's only a tangential interest of mine, but yeah, I don't really think there's a reason to believe that he was like super conservative or anything, and like a philosopher hater so much as he was just like I take it he was pretty happy to lampoon any political figure. He certainly took figures who probably didn't agree with one another very much, and mocked them together. He doesn't really seem to care. It's just figures who are identifiable feature a lot. Some of it maybe you can take as particular political shenanigans. He does have one figure who was almost definitely a like actual political issue with Cleon, um, about whom I admittedly don't know a ton, but I do know that he and Aristophanes got into an actual legal battle over Aristophanes' comedy, after which I'm pretty sure Aristophanes won it, and then he continued making fun of Cleon. So this did not go over well for Mr. Cleon, but yeah, he was a figure of some political note in Athens, and he gets very thinly veiled jabs at him like constantly. In
So these like
like
portrayals could be like become quite personal and contentious and controversial then.
yeah, yeah, they could. What we see with Socrates, I don't really think even comes close to that level. He and I mean, we do know that Plato depicts Aristophanes eating dinner with Socrates and other figures without seemingly like that. It wasn't like portrayed as being like odd, like they're just there. They
No,
clearly
that's
knew each
true.
other. They probably were like fine. It doesn't seem to be like a tremendous political animosity there.
That's
Um,
true. I mean,
I,
Aristotle, or sorry, Plato puts in Aristophanes' mouth the famous story of like, we used to be, two beings, combined together, then we were separated by the gods because the gods were jealous. I guess I only bring it up because, and I don't know how accurate this is, it probably played less of a role than many other things, but I know some people argue that Aristophanes' portrayal of Socrates did help bring about his legal.
Yeah, I don't really buy that. Like,
Okay.
it's possible. I mean, we're always working with fragmentary information, right?
Sure.
Like, that's the thing about classical studies. You never know anything. This is the great tragedy of comedy. Yeah, like you wind up in a like in Socratean terms, I'm aphoric right now. Like, it is possible that is the case, but I don't see any reason to believe it without, unless we alight upon new sources that suggest that Aristophanes was genuinely responsible. I don't really.
It's probably
I
fair
wonder
to
if
say.
Horace mentions it. I would have to look into that. I know Horace talks a lot about Aristophanes and old comedy generally, but
it's probably fair
I
to
don't know.
that Socrates probably didn't need a lot of help making enemies.
Yeah, I think that's really my main issue with this argument. Yeah, like, Socrates was just not really good at making friends. he didn't seem too interested in it either. Like, he stood out in the agora and just like harassed random passersby about like respectfully bullshit philosophical questions. Like,
well, I don't know.
I would also be really irritated with him if I was an ancient Greek, is what I'm saying. Like, I would not have liked Socrates. Like,
I would
dog,
say
I'm here to buy some fish. Like, why are we talking about the nature of the gods? Like,
I would say more Socrates was a polarizing figure, because he did have his followers. He did have like his rich friends who loved him and fed him and like even offered to like their properties outside Athens when he was like.
I think the problem is, like, yeah, he had devoted followers, but like the general population of Athens seems clearly to not have liked him very much.
He pissed off a lot of influential politicians, I think, was the in large part what happened.
Well, and it's like after the reinstatement of democracy, democracy was never quite as liberal again. They suddenly were much more concerned, perhaps understandably. The Republican politicians are like very like concerned about different influences that might destroy the democracy. Before that, they didn't have to worry about that so much. Athens was a dominant power in Greece and was doing just fine, but then they got their asses kicked by Sparta and briefly were ruled by the 30. And so it's like after that they're like, okay, maybe we should concern ourselves with the protecting the values that make democracy possible.
No, that's fair. I mean, and Socrates is also a friend with Alcibiades. Alcibiades, of course.
I could do a whole episode on Alcibiades. Might be my favorite Athenian, to be honest. So
not only did Socrates like piss off influential politicians, he had the wrong friends for the moment, for the political moment.
Not just Alcibiades, the leader of the 30 was one of his students.
Yes.
And he was friends with quite a few other members of it. So he really picked a terrible time to
and he was critical of the 30, but not enough to save him, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like when you're in bed with half of them, it's like not literally in bed, probably. I mean, it's ancient Greece, so who knows?
He did pine after. He did pine after.
I meant in bed in the political sense. Alcibiades.
He did pine after Alcibiades. I guess we don't know if they had a relationship, but he was at least attracted to him.
Wait, was he the? Is that true? I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, at least according to
Was he the pederast for Alcibiades?
uh, I don't think we entirely know. I mean, I think there's some passages that would suggest that Socrates was like pined for him, but like held back. So I don't know if we entirely know the full depths of their
Okay,
relationship.
they
But
definitely banged.
he was definitely attracted. He was definitely attracted to Alcibiades, like no
I
question.
mean, apparently everyone in Athens was. Again, Alcibiades could be his own episode. Wacky guy, banged like basically every man and woman in Athens, and by doing so, made a lot of political alliances and was able to get away with shit that like no other Athenian could have possibly imagined. He betrayed Athens and Sparta and Persia in the same war.
He's like
and came back to Athens and was accepted back. It's crazy.
He was like the Talleyrand of Athens. He just like somehow,
yes, Talleyrand is a very good.
And,
Talleyrand is a very good. I don't know. Even Talleyrand was not like not an intrigue person like Alcibiades. Alcibiades is like maybe unparalleled the level of intrigue he got into. And the fact that he did half of it by banging is just that much funnier. Like the reason he got kicked out of Sparta was because he cucked the one of the kings, which is just great. That's awesome. But anyway, we are so far off track. Alcibiades, incidentally, is another person who features quite a bit in Aristophanes' plays. And again, I take it's probably not really extremely strong political critique. Maybe it was in its own time, but it doesn't seem to read that way. It's just like he was like one of the most recognizable Athenians in all of human history. So, and especially in his own time. So, but so Aristophanes is really like again, he's the what we think of as like the high point of old comedy. There's a few other figures featuring heavily at that time. So like Euripides is maybe it's always hard to tell. Aristophanes, he's always lampooning everything, but Euripides features as a protagonist of more than one Aristophanic play.
Really?
Oh yeah. So you want to talk about meta theater? There's at least 2 plays that I can think of off the top of my head, which are about Euripides making plays.
Did he also make fun of him as well?
He does make fun of him, yeah. In The Frogs, which is maybe Aristophanes' most well-known play, shy of Lysistrata, Dionysus. Of course, this is all at a play being performed at the festival of Dionysus. Dionysus is the protagonist, and he goes down to the underworld to bring back a poet, because in the play there's no tragedian who's good enough anymore. So Dionysus has to go to the underworld to find a suitable tragedian for the Dionysia. And they hold a competition between Euripides and Aeschylus. This is part of why I gave that spiel on what they're like to read, because they go back and forth like quoting lines of their plays, some of which are extant, which is really fun. So they're going back and forth with each other, dropping bars, and then ultimately Dionysus decides that Euripides sucks. Which, even though he doesn't say sucks, but that Aeschylus is better, so he brings Aeschylus back, and like in the world of the play, Dionysus and Euripides are like personal friends. Like they're like Euripides is like, wait, hey, you promised that I was going to win this. And Euripides is like, sorry, man, he's just better. And he just leaves, which is just awesome. I just love that. There's that going, and yeah, like so. Tragedy features heavily as like a meta-theatrical element of comedy around this time, especially in Aristophanes. Aristophanes seems to have really, really liked Euripides, though. Like he likes lampooning him, but he clearly likes him a lot. I mean, he quotes him all the time. It's really, really interesting.
I should have said earlier, I think, I misspoke earlier, I think. Where I was getting this idea that Euripides wasn't popular was, so you mentioned the competitions between playwrights. This might also be incorrect, so let me know if it is, but I was under the impression that Euripides often did get last place in a lot of those competitions.
Oh, I'm sure he did with some of them. Right off the top of my head, I know Thesmophoria Zeusai, the women at the Thesmophoria, which is a thing I don't have time to get too deep into, but that one I know didn't win. I mean, quite a few of his extant plays were not winners in their own time. But I mean, that's any tragedian. I mean, I think being a tragedian whose name, let alone their works, survive from that time indicates that quite a few people must have liked them.
Oh yeah, definitely.
There's no other reason that like so much of their work would have made it. That is one thing I think that's worth remembering about all ancient texts. We have in the Latin corpus, I couldn't give you a number on the Greek corpus, but it's estimated that 90% of all Latin literature is just lost from that time. Like from the ancient world, like 90%. We have 10% of major works of literature from the time, which is crazy to think about how much more there must be out there, because we actually have quite a bit, but it's like, yeah, like some of it just didn't make it. Sometimes it's stuff that probably was pretty good, like Ovid's Medea. I would be fascinated to read, even though Ovid makes my head spin and I don't always enjoy him. Yeah, he's a fascinating. That would be fascinating, but a lot of it probably didn't make it because it wasn't good. If it made it, there's a chance that there was at least something worth saving there.
I have a question then about genres. So, was there how like, and I assume this is also based on individual playwrights, but were the genres very like explicitly separated, or were there some playwrights that were more willing to like?
Yeah, they actually had like divisions of the competition based on what kind of play it was. Yeah. Yes, in the comedy and tragedy, that division was invented by the ancients. I'm trying to think of what the name tragedy is kind of obscure. We don't know exactly what it means. Comoidia means to engage in a drunken choral song, because that's or at least supposedly. There's maybe a couple of other potential meanings for it, but that's the komos was a choral exit song where they all get wildly drunk for Dionysus. So that's fun. But yes, in short, yeah, they were extremely explicitly divided. It's really not until the time of somebody we'll talk about in a little bit, Plautus, that the concept of them even being mixed makes sense. The real like comedy and tragedy, while they in some sense mean what they mean today, the absolute defining line is that tragedy, the protagonist doesn't fulfill whatever their goal is, and in comedy they do. There's a lot of other features which are particular to them, but that is the absolute, this must be. So yeah, they are definitely distinct genres. But so yeah, does that answer your question?
I think it does. I had thought you had said earlier something about, and this sounds like almost a contradiction in terms, so I might be misremembering what you said, but something about tragic elements lending themselves to the comedy. I was wondering how those interact, if they were the genres.
So they do interact all the time. Yes.
Okay.
As I said, Euripides features as a protagonist in more than one play of Aristophanes. But what's going on in comedy is usually elements of tragedy are being lampooned. So,
I see what you mean.
in Women at the Thesmophoria's Deusai, the uh, one of the antagonists, Agathon, who is also another tragedian. The protagonist being Euripides and his father-in-law, I think, Nasilicus. Um, but Euripides is like he goes to the house of Agathon because he wants to get Agathon, who is apparently known for dressing and acting very effeminately. That's extremely relevant. There's a bunch of jokes about that in the play. It's great. But he goes to the house of Agathon and knocks on his door, basically to ask him to represent him, because the women at the Thesmophoria, which is like it's like an assembly of women that they get together. I forget the exact like religious implications of it, but honestly, it doesn't matter that much for the play because the Thesmophoria is presented like the Athenian Boule. It's like the Athenian Legislative Council, but if it were made up of women, from the mind of a misogynistic Athenian man. So it's great. But so he's like he tries to get Agathon to go represent him before the women because Agathon's like a woman. There's all kinds of funny ha-has about that, but anyway, the reason that I bring it up, aside from the fact that it's two tragedians as primary characters of the play, an important tragic element that features in this play is this machine. I'm actually glad you asked this because I wanted to talk about these. There's a couple of machines that are used in the Athenian skene, the scene. It's like a little stage building that they put up and take down at the theater. It's made out of wood. Unfortunately, none of those survive. But and they usually are equipped with a couple of different like machines that help facilitate different things. So in this play, Agathon is wheeled out on this machine called the Ekuklema, the like wheel out machine. It's basically what it literally means. And the mechanisms of these machines are not super well known because the ancients, apparently they were relatively simple, so the ancients didn't like feel the need to like explain them. They're pretty self-explanatory apparently if you see them. But regardless, it's like it like rolls people out on like a little cot basically, using a hidden mechanism behind the stage. And so Agathon, this machine is usually used in tragedy for dead bodies. Okay, like whenever there's like scenes of people who've all like been slaughtered mercilessly or killed themselves, there's a lot of suicide in tragedy, obviously. So they tend to get wheeled out. The body gets wheeled out on the Ekuklema. Agathon rolls in on the Ekuklema. So there's all kinds of humor surrounding elements which are familiar from tragedy. There's also this other machine known as the mechane, which is it's like it's basically just literally it just means the machine, and it's like it's like a big winch basically, and it's used for all kinds of stuff. In the clouds, I think it's used for to like have Socrates descending like a god, which is yeah. So there's all kinds of stuff going on with that is not always 100% clear, but a lot of times comedy helps us understand tragedy like retroactively because characters are making jokes that help to make sense of what these machines did. So that's that, which like they'll be using words like technical terms like Agathon whenever because he's followed by a chorus of women whenever he's rolled in, and he's like he makes all these jokes about being wheeled in and wheeled out and stuff. It's great. But yeah, so anyway, so yeah, that's Aristophanes. In short, is mostly known for the extremes of certain features of old comedy. But he doesn't do the mythological burlesque that much, which I think is kind of interesting. There's a couple of his play titles which indicate that's probably what they were, but most of his plays are about current events and relevant figures engaged in what we call the great idea comedy, where the protagonist is like, I have a problem, and then they think of a totally ridiculous idea that doesn't make any sense in real life, and then they just apply that and take it to its logical conclusion. So, like, of course, in the Lysistrata, the great idea is, okay, so the Peloponnesian War is going on. We need to, and the women don't give a shit about the war, and that the men are dragging out for seemingly no reason. Keeping in mind, the Peloponnesian War went on for quite a while. It was a reasonably long war, and a lot of cities were just like laid totally to waste. It was pretty brutal. And so the women, which I find interesting because usually Aristophanes is a pretty misogynistic poet, all things considered. But he basically makes the women the reasonable ones. He makes the way that they a lot of the humor is pretty sexist throughout the play, because a lot of it centers on like how the women can hardly control themselves. At one point, a woman's like masturbating on a rope because she can't contain herself. It's pretty funny. Conceptually, it's pretty funny. It's really phenomenal stuff. But there's actually a series of like sketches that a French artist did back in like the late 19th century. That's all around the Lysistrata. They're really well done. Very fascinating stuff. And the Lysistrata was not well liked by a lot of classicists for a long time because it was seen as like corrupting for morals to read.
It was like too feminist almost.
No, it's vile. It's
Oh,
sinful. which is pretty great. That's a thing we could talk about one day, maybe. The what we call what's the term? It's like I don't know, some of the classics and how they were treated for years because of the situation in classics and society in general. Because of course, classics was kind of emerging on the tail end of the Victorian period. So you get a whole lot of, really until the last couple decades, there was a lot of discomfort with a lot of material. It's very fun. So you get very silly stuff like in the Lewis and Short dictionary, the or not Lewis. Well, Lewis and Short does it too, but especially the Little Scott Jones, basically the Greek dictionary for like a century or better. It's got a storied history in classics, and basically everyone uses it. It still has like extremely outdated or like weird terms for things. Like sometimes for things that it deems too offensive, it will translate them into Latin. it's like I don't even know what the point of that is. If there's two ways that can happen. So like you could get people who can't read it, in which case, I mean, I guess that's good. But like most people who are going to be reading this can read Latin. These are classicists. So they're going to know what it says anyway. So I don't know I don't know.
I guess they were afraid if their wives...
Brutishness of classicness is very funny.
If their wives had just opened up the Greek dictionary, they might have seen a bad word. So
maybe, and Aristophanes is like a treasure trove of history of classicists being horrified. You get like so many translations from yesteryear of him are just horrible and suck because like they're like desperately trying not to translate all the filth, and it's still pretty filthy.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that points to like a broader conversation, which is like
it does.
Some people take sort of the perspective that, well, gallows humor or like toilet humor is like inferior. It's only, it's immature. Only, middle schoolers would laugh at stuff like that.
Well, it's not even just that. Like it was seen as genuinely like corrupting. Like there's a an edition. Let me see if I can. I'm gonna grab it real quick. I bought this actually very recently. This edition of Plautus. I don't know if you can see it that well, but this edition of Plautus's Bacchides, which is a play about several about these sisters who are prostitutes, and they engage in all these like insane deception plots and shenanigans. But and the entire like most of the introduction is Dr. McCosh attempting to justify the study of Plautus within a Christian education. As it's really interesting. Like he's like, yeah, like there's all kinds of like sinful stuff in here. You got to watch out, but it's still really good because Saint Jerome liked Plautus. And he's like, and he talks about like Augustine and how Augustine read comedy and stuff. It's pretty interesting. But
I was going to try to make a slightly separate point, which is I think despite the fact that some people view filth as like lesser comedy, it's one of those. It does transcend time and culture, though.
It does.
It's the kind of humor that really, it doesn't matter what time or place you grew up in. You're probably going to get it, and you're probably going to think it's a little funny.
Yep.
That might be partly why. That might be partly why Aristophanes. That might be partly why Aristophanes has lasted. He's just a great playwright in general, but also just like filth sells.
Maybe, but I don't know because, it's not. There's no reason to believe that other comedians, at least the ancients, didn't seem to regard Aristophanes as much more filthy than his contemporaries. Old comedy is kind of known for that generally. So I don't know. It's possible. I'm not sure. I don't know why he makes it instead of someone like Eupolis, who is another playwright, who another comedian contemporary with Aristophanes, who he actually makes a bunch of jokes at his expense, and he accuses him of like plagiarism stuff. There's a running rivalry between them. They actually seem to have maybe been friends though, but yeah, it's I don't know. It's hard to say. But regardless, Aristophanes is very, very filthy. Very filthy. We love it. And then, moving on from old comedy, which has taken up longer than I thought it would, but that's okay. It's worth spending time on because it's relevant for everything. After sort of the high point of old comedy, there's a few other playwrights that come after Aristophanes who are kind of considered part of that same tradition. And then it develops into what gets called middle comedy. Yeah, okay. So, where was I? Oh, yeah. So middle comedy is generally defined as the period of comic development between Aristophanes and Menander. Menander being someone relevant for later. Politics are mostly absent from what we can tell. There doesn't seem to have been the sort of aggressive political bent of people like Aristophanes. That kind of was a fad, it seems, for a couple of decades. Eupolis, for example, again, contemporary, rival, maybe friend of Aristophanes, was sort of he seems to have done similar stuff, but it's ultimately it kind of dies out. And this leads to some interesting theories down the line, but why exactly that died out. But names that appear, you get people like Alexis. He appears to have written a lot of what we call the Hetaira comedies. These are relevant for the evolution of what we call new comedy with Menander and people like that. You start seeing the stock characters, which become very important to new comedy. You get people like a pimp, a slave merchant. That's a common character archetype. Usually, pimps get abused throughout every play. They're despised. You get the ephebes, so that's like young men nearly of military age. These often are uh, portrayed as like lovesick. You get the soldiers who tend to be self-aggrandizing, that sort of thing. And hetairae, prostitutes, who are known for being in comedy, get portrayed as very money hungry. No doubt representing the views of a lot of Athenian men, um, who would have been soliciting their services, no doubt. Um, and it's worth remembering in the Greek context, especially as we move into the Roman context, where things change a lot in that regard. Um, Hetairae were actually like members of high society generally. They were not being like an escort was not a low class profession. There were like sex slaves and such that existed, but being a being a hetaira, that the term actually means it's the feminine form of the term for like a comrade in arms, uh, or a close friend, a hetairos. And a hetaira, similarly, is usually they're well educated. They're women who are expected to be able to like. Uh, they're oftentimes seen as better than your wife. um, they're that's kind of the Athenian conception of them. Like your wife, women, am I right? And they're like, they're uh, not expected to step into the political sphere at all. They're supposed to be, quiet, dormant, domestic. Whereas hetairae are supposed to be able to engage in discussions about politics and philosophy and the world and military even. So there are often Attic poetry speaks very highly of them. Uh, so yeah, and that's relevant because in these plays you get hetairae, and they're generally they're in comedy. They're worse traits that are ascribed to them. They're money hungry. They're often tricky. Like these are, we're seeing the worst side of all characters generally, and that's kind of a theme with comedy generally, is that it's people that you would probably interact with in some way in your life, but they are um, you see the silly side. I mean, it's like comedy today. Um, you okay?
I'm listening.
Oh, okay. um, uh, yeah. So names to know out of middle comedy. I mean, doesn't really matter. We don't know a lot about most of them. Um, one of the more bawdy, filthy comics of this time, especially as we move into new comedy, which tends to be very um, restrained in that regard, by relatively speaking. We get this guy Timocles, and it's worth noting that a lot of the middle comics that we do know are non-Athenians. So, like the Dionysia was a sort of it's a religious festival, but it's also an Athenian civic affair, and so like the figures associated with it were supposed to be Athenian citizen men. That's sort of the ideal in the mind of an Athenian. Um, and so it's kind of a new phenomenon to have non-Athenians writing for this. Um, and it's worth noting, of course, there are other theaters throughout the Greek world, and some of them were putting on plays that probably weren't Athenian, that did not survive. But it's hard to know a lot about them. Unfortunately, as is often the case, our texts that have survived are very Athenocentric for a lot of different reasons, not least of which being Athens' relative wealth and prestige. Um, but regardless, yeah. So it's kind of a big deal though in the Athenian space for non-Athenians to be writing poetry, So Timocles, who is Athenian, seems to be maybe trying to revive old comedy. He's returning to trends that existed in old comedy. He makes them very bawdy, very filthy, and such. But of course, it's hard to draw a whole lot out of these because again, middle comedy is all fragments. There's no entire plays. So what you can draw out of it is pretty limited on a good day.
So was this is a very general question, but do we know of any any political context that might have changed the character of Athenian theater, or no?
So I mean, in mid to late old comedy, right? Around the time of Aristophanes and Socrates, as we were talking about, Socrates, he's associated with the 30, which did not pan out well for him. There is a period of revived Athenian democracy, and then, I'm trying to. Oh God, Athenian political history is so weird. There's so many coups and attempted takeovers, and then some of them work, some of them don't. I can never remember, never keep it all straight.
I was just curious.
I don't recall any significant political shifts until we get to the end of middle comedy, which Timocles is pretty close to that, as I understand. But at the end of middle comedy, as we're going into new comedy, something very important does happen, which is the Macedonians, right? Mm-hmm. So, of course, we think of Alexander the Great and these people. But really, the relevant person for this is Philip II, who he's preparing a war against Persia. And his idea is to unite the Greeks in a sort of alliance, but he's turning them all into satellite states, effectively. You get all these important figures like Demosthenes around this time. Demosthenes is Cassander, but Athens is it's sort of seen as Athens' last stand, basically, where Athens fights its great war against Macedon and gets totally crushed. It's not quite as epic as they make it out. They kind of just got dumpstered, and because Athens, as usual, sucks at land combat. Also, this is extremely funny and not really that important, but to me at least, is that Macedon basically conquered Greece by just making their spears longer than everyone else's. That is basically literally the reason they won. The general, the thing that Greeks were really good at is heavy infantry. Big armored dudes with big shields and big long spears. Something that the Persians really could not figure out a way to deal with. They could outflank it with their cavalry, but it's still very hard to deal with just a bunch of dudes with extremely long spears, like comically long. They would be 12 feet long, just sticking out. Well, anyway, so yeah, they had their 12-foot spears. And then the Macedonians figured out you could just make 20-foot spears and then nobody else could beat you. And nobody figured out a way to beat this. So they all just got their asses kicked, which is just, I'm sorry, terribly funny to me.
I'm pretty sure that's just the great cycle of history. Man with spear conquers area. Man with bigger spear conquers afterwards.
It seems like parody. It really does seem like a parody of historical military technological innovation. They didn't develop doctrine really at all. They just were what if we just had a bigger spear? And then they just won. That's crazy. But yeah, but it worked. So Macedon, for our purposes, is important because they defeat the Second Athenian League, which was Athens's attempt to basically get the old Delian League, which was kind of their empire, sort of theoretically independent states, in practice basically all Athenian puppets. As one member of the league figured out when they tried to break away and if Athens laid waste to them. Very unfortunate that. Thucydides, for the his part, wrote very highly of the people who did that. They resisted Athens, and he basically made Athens out as the monsters, even though he was Athenian. So, very interesting. Ancient historiography is another subject for another day. I'm getting off topic, but so yeah. But Athens basically tried to get those guys all together again. This in the Second Athenian League, they and to resist Macedon. They got totally crushed because Big Spear. And so Macedon gave terms to Athens, which were actually relatively lenient. They didn't put a wait. No, that's not true. They did establish a garrison there, though, and they put in some Macedenophile Athenian politicians as basically the puppet rulers of Athens. This is where Athenian democracy basically dies forever. And the reason that's relevant is because it's thought, not known, but it's thought that this is a lot of the reason that comedy turns to the domestic sphere. And this is why you get people like Menander. Menander is probably the second best known Greek comedian. We have 97 titles and around 100 plays attributed to him. We have 97 titles that are known, probably. And so this idea, he's kind of in ancient scholarship, and thus modern scholarship has kind of adopted it, as often happens. He's kind of portrayed as like the anti-Aristophanes. Where Aristophanes is filthy, Menander is clean. Where Aristophanes talks about politics, Menander talks about women. Where, and other things of the domestic sphere. Where, he is basically given as the strongest contrast we have to Aristophanes. Maybe not unjustifiably. He nearly disappeared. His works almost were totally lost. For centuries, we thought they were just gone forever. Because he was basically a lot of the way that Greek texts got saved over the centuries is their use in Byzantine school books. And the reason for him not being included, I mean, there's a lot of hypotheses. It doesn't matter that much, but some people say maybe it's because it's too easy. Most of what you read of Menander, at least the fragments we have, and we have one single entire play and a couple of plays that are in somewhat complete form. But what we have of him seems to be very like easy Attic Greek relative to some of the other comedians. Like Aristophanes was read largely because he's seen as like an exponent of classical Greek, high Attic. It's sort of in the same vein as Euripides or Aeschylus. I honestly find that kind of questionable. I find Aristophanes a lot easier to read than anything Aeschylus has, but whatever.
So I wonder, like, you mentioned the like dramas about the domestic sphere.
Yeah.
What it makes me think of was what you see in like if you look at the Greek history, you will notice that around the time that like Stoicism and Epicureanism became popular was also around the time when Greece no longer had its political
Right.
it was under Roman control. So the ability to really engage in day-to-day politics was sort of taken from you. And so I guess it's kind of like the idea of, well, then let's, people are going to want to adopt the philosophy that focuses on the self, focuses on what you can control, focuses on the simple things.
Right.
And so I wonder if it's something similar with comedy, like back when Athenian democracy was still around, people could be politically engaged. So this was on their mind. So it was topic of conversation. So it was fair game. But under the Macedonians, then it became a focus on the domestic sphere because that was what they had control over.
That is a prevalent scholarly theory. Of course, it's not like they were telling us why they did this, so we don't know.
I mean,
Some scholars of the ancient world had thoughts, but I mean, to what extent they're correct, it's hard to say. What we do know is the locus classicus for this idea that it retreats into the domestic sphere as a result of the imposition of authoritarian rule is actually Horace, the Roman poet who wrote his Ars Poetica, the art of poetry, and he talks about he talks about it as a good thing. he describes which it's hard to tell. I've not read the Ars Poetica in any great detail, so I decline to give my thoughts on it exactly. There's some thought that maybe it was intended satirically, which is certainly in Horace's purview, so I could certainly see that being the case. But he says that it was a good thing that the law now regulated comedy because that caused the poetry to be improved. He was praising the end of free speech very explicitly.
Is this also again, where? I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add. So we mentioned neoclassical, like French theater, like neoclassical verse drama earlier. Is Horace about the one of the main sources for I guess what were called the three unities, like the rules for what a good tragedy should be?
I don't know. I can't say.
Okay, I think that's the case. I'm not. I'd have to double check on that.
That seems likely. It seems like something he would write about, but I'm not a huge Horace guy. I've always found him to be but he's many people love Horace. I've always found his poetry to be kind of to be honest with you.
Diderot loved Horace.
Oh, that
as many of the philosophers did, actually.
Yes, I do know that. Yeah, a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers were big into Horace, and that's good. I'm glad some of his stuff has really made it. But Roman lyric in general is always it's okay for me. I like Catullus a lot better, but
I suspect the philosophers might have liked someone like Horace because a lot of them were very didactic. A lot of them wanted to be like teachers and educators, and so they would aspire to be like a didactic lyric poet that would give a new morality for the new age, sort of thing.
So Horace, Horace makes this case in his Ars Poetica anyway that it's a good thing that a law was introduced to regulate comedy, which apparently didn't exist. As far as we could tell, there's not actually a law on it. So again, he might have been misremembering some history. Maybe he's exaggerating to make his point, which would make sense in his own political context, since, of course, he's writing with the rise of Augustus. And he's known for maybe taking some jabs at that. That's a whole subject for its own video, but a lot of the Roman poets around that time are known for making very veiled potential criticism of the regime, dressed up with flowery language and very confusing metaphors, because if you're too loud, then you get the Ovid treatment and you get like shipped off to the Black Sea. So you gotta be careful about that stuff under Augustus.
I did look it up, by the way. So Horace did emphasize that tragedy should adhere to a specific style and tone, with a focus on serious and lofty subjects. He also advocated for the classical unities, time, place, and action, and advised against Deus ex machina, and stress the importance of character consistency and emotional truth. So
Huh.
that was in the art of poetry.
It makes sense. Um, yeah, I mean that certainly seems like him. Um, but yeah, okay, good. But yeah, so uh, regardless of the reason for it, comedy retreats into the domestic sphere. Of course, we talked about some of the things which would become more prominent in new comedy. You get the stock characters who keep appearing over and over again. So, like in old comedy, characters are very much like people in like a very like direct sense. Like often it's like an actual person who really is in Athens, probably alive, um, uh, or somebody who's relatively recently dead, like within the past century. It's people who would be familiar to people, and when it's not that, they're still like they act as like individual characters. They have like things about them that are really identifiable about them as an individual. With Menander, his characters are very like they're stock. They tend to have they're more identified by the type of character they are than them as an individual. Um, so of course, your hetaira, your prostitutes, again, money grubbing, uh, mischievous. You get the clever slave archetype, which comes to dominate in Roman comedy. That becomes a whole thing, which we'll get into. but this is where this sort of originates. This I um, that slaves are constantly trying to deceive their masters and overturn the social hierarchy. You get braggart soldiers again who are constantly self-aggrandizing. All of these different archetypes are really what defines the characters. um, and Menander uses this sort of setup to create basically almost morality plays a lot of times. That's really kind of what they come down to. They are funny at times. He makes jokes. It's not like totally lifeless or anything. There's a stereotype of Menander which I think is a little unfair, that he like just totally deprives his stuff of humor, which isn't really accurate, but it's certainly much more muted than Aristophanes. You're probably, if you ever read like the Grouch or the Double Deceiver, you're not going to find yourself like heaving and hawing or anything. It's like fine. Um, so, but Menander, his main seeming his main objective seems to have been moral education through theater. So all of his plays basically, they start with some domestic disturbance, be it a young man in love with a prostitute. A lot of them focus on young men raping citizen women, young women. Um, and then by the end of the play, the rapist and victim are reconciled and married. It's bizarre. The thinking is that that like I guess like washes over the crime, and the young man takes his place as a citizen within Athens. That's the thinking, it seems. Um,
So
which
did this idea of the comedy of manners, did it become influential in like the Middle Ages and the Renaissance as well later on, or
yeah, to an extent, yes. Although those sorts of comedies, they're a little different from this, as I
yeah,
understand. I've not done a whole lot with that, but yeah. Um, Menander is kind of the locus classicus, if you like, for that sort of thing.
okay,
Um, he seems to have been quite and like it seems the ancients recognized him as being rather different in a lot of ways from his contemporaries. Other new comics contemporary with Menander would be Diphilus, who's from Sinope, which is in Asia Minor. He is, and there's Philemon, um, about whom I don't know how much is really known about him, but he does appear. I think one or two of his plays gets adapted by Terrence, and that's really why the new comics are actually like super meaningful. Um, their uh, their works get turned into Roman comedy. The reason I think it's their stuff that gets really popular in Rome and not um, old comedy. Old comedy really doesn't take off in Rome at all. Um, but new comedy does, and I think the reason for that is largely old comedy being so centered around the polis of Athens, right? There's all these figures who, I mean, maybe would be recognizable to Romans. I'm sure a lot of Romans knew who Aeschylus was. I'm sure, certainly by the time Plautus was writing, they would have known who Euripides is, or at least a lot of them would, because, and there's yeah. So that's I think it's really because domestic comedy can be reproduced endlessly, right? Like we're never I don't think we're ever going to reach a point in human society where husbands and wives aren't fighting. We're not going to reach a point where young men aren't hooking up, right? Like there's all of these like in various forms. All of these things kind of transcend time and space, so they can be readily adapted to a Roman audience.
Also, if you just
And,
look at like sitcoms on television, so many
right,
of them are just a
stock
family,
plots. Yep.
stock plots and a family and the shenanigans that this particular family gets up to, but usually they're like reconciled at the end and they love each other, et cetera, et cetera.
A project that we did when I was in high school Latin. This has been years and years and years ago, but it stuck with me all these years. I think it really helped solidify this concept for me. We watched an episode of a 50s British sitcom,
Yeah.
and we took the stock character archetypes of Roman comedy and applied them to the characters in the show, and they mapped on like almost perfectly. Like the clever slave, they didn't have a slave, but they had an immediate servant.
Yeah.
A butler served that purpose and did the exact same shit. It's like all of these things are, they for whatever reason they've been identifiable over the centuries and are very reusable in different situations. So that seems to be the reason that the new comedy really took off in Rome in some sense. Which brings us to the Roman context. um, so basically, I'm trying to think of trying to make sure my numbers are straight. Like 100 some years after Menander's writing. So Menander's writing in like he's writing about give or take 70 years after Aristophanes dies. He's and at the very end of like the Athenian comic cycle as we understand it. Um, by the time Plautus comes onto the scene, and he's our first comedian who is really who survives from Rome. He It's immediately after the first Punic War, going into the or not immediately, but a few years after the first Punic War, going into the second Punic War, um, and those are sort of the timestamps that a lot of scholars use. I prefer to use the context of the Macedonian Wars as well, because the way that Plowtime theater works, so much of it relies on Roman exposure to Greeks. And of course, there are Greeks in Carthaginian territory in southern Italy, but most of these Greeks are coming in from the newly conquered territories in Greece and Macedon. They're being imported often as slaves, and so that's really the world in which Plowtime theater starts to make sense. really interacting with Greek ideas in new and interesting ways. Um, and yeah, and then so
Before you continue your thought, I just wanted to ask. So we're almost at an hour and 40.
yeah,
I don't know how
yeah.
much.
I figure we'll briefly touch on Terrence and then
Okay,
leave it off.
that's fine. We can do another episode on more Roman comedy if
That's
you want to do
kind
that.
of the thinking. I didn't realize how long it would take me to get through the Greek cycle, but that's okay. It's worth
I
it.
was asking a lot of questions, so my
That's fine. That's fine. It's what we're here for. Um, but yeah, so Plautus is mostly known for being bombastic in his adaptation of Greek comedy, which we will talk about in more depth next time. I mean, characters do just totally absurd things. He he takes basically the basic plots of new comedy and then just does kind of whatever he wants with them. He doesn't. He uses the technical term in Latin of the time for translation, "vortere," to turn, which has really the like mechanical implication of turning a screw. I think that's a really good metaphor for what he's doing. This isn't really like translate always. Sometimes he does literally just seem to translate a section. But most of the time, what he's doing is he takes like the plot elements and then just like lets them go off the rails. His characters are more stock characters than they are in Menander or Philemon or Diphilus. Like they are egregiously stock characters, often to the point of being like extremely meta theatrical, which is a very fun thing to talk about. But yeah, so that's kind of Plautus in a nutshell. He's generally recognized as the funnier of the Roman comics. Terence, who is often described as his successor, I don't really buy that at all. I'm sorry. I think it's a very silly theory if you read any Terence at all. But Terence is he takes Greek comedy and does the opposite, where Plautus makes things more bombastic, characters more stock than character. Terence is often, Cicero describes him as Menander cum Latina voce. That is Menander with a Latin voice. He is like he's more Menander than Menander, to be honest. In a lot of ways, he's very concerned with, as Menander was, with naturalistic portrayals of domestic life and conflict and resolution, and his characters speak in very like intelligible Latin. Very whereas Plautus loves insane puns, sometimes multilingual puns. He's hopping between things. He does very silly stuff with language and music as well. Terence, he retains music, but it seems to only be because it's expected. Like it's not really, it never seems to be like an extremely important element of his work. You could very easily put on a Terentian play without the music and you wouldn't lose much. It's always very simple meters, much in the same style as Menander, maybe even more so. And he's something extremely funny to me is that both Cicero and Caesar, of all people, two people who were often diametrically opposed in the Roman political space, often arguing, rarely got along on anything. They did manage to both have surviving descriptions of him that praised his like ability as a writer and as a portrayer of of natural life, and also said that he wasn't funny at all. Probably the least funny comedian.
Terence was.
Yes, yes, he was mocked in his own time and then after for not being funny at all. And you know, maybe there are elements that are lost to us. There's certainly these what we call knockabout scenes where usually a pimp, but sometimes other people as well, but especially pimps get beat up on stage, which is a relatively new innovation in Roman theater at this point. They generally it was kind of a taboo to have stage violence, but Terence loved those, and so people did seem to enjoy those. There's a whole thing in the Adelphoi where he has to like justify his reappropriation of a scene from a play that Plautus has translated. Um, he's apparently been accused of plagiarism by um, by some contemporary critics. So he argues that Plautus left this scene out in his adaptation, which unfortunately his play Sunapotnes Gontes, which means dying together, beautiful title, but is lost. So we cannot actually compare them. But according to Terence, that scene was completely left out. And it seems to have only been included. Like there are elements of it that don't even make sense with the plot. Like they seem to have like a recognition scene, which is usually like when a character gets like their true identity gets recognized usually as like a citizen as opposed to a slave. That's a very common trope. And there's like a moment in there where like the young man who's beating up the pimp is like yeah, I think like we can actually take this girl because like actually she's not even a slave, but like it doesn't make any sense because she absolutely is. like there's literally no reason to believe that at this point in the play. It's the third scene of the play. It's so bizarre, but yeah. So he did seem to like those a lot, though, to the point of apparently not even caring about his own plot and just like inserting them at random places so he could have a pimp get beat up on stage, which you know I'm sure was pretty entertaining. But but yeah, so and that's kind of Terrence. He if there was humor, it seems to have mostly been like that sort of thing, like slapstick. And not so much like verbal humor. There's these scenes which do feel a little bit like Plautus, where like characters will keep interrupting each other's sentences and stuff. And those are they're a little funny, but they're not anything like Plautus in terms of like comic value, which seems to have been his intention. There's some debate about this in scholarly circles. What is Terence doing? Like, what is the point of anything he's doing? It doesn't, because what he's doing doesn't really like fall in line with like comic trends, especially in Rome. Like after Plautus, it seems like a lot of the comedians were they wanted stuff to be very funny, very entertaining, and Terence doesn't really seem to care that much about like stuff being funny. And I think the reason really comes down to he's very interested in this idea of like developing almost a new genre, and I think it's kind of a like he seems to be really experimenting with an idea that is very popular in our media today of like domestic drama as its own thing rather than like comedy per se. It's like conflict resolution as theater, which I mean I it's pretty interesting. And I gotta say I used to hate Terrence. I used to not do much Terrence at all. But as I get older and as I get better with my Latin, I find his writing very refreshing. It's very much like real humans talking to each other. It's very cool in that particular way. But that's Terrence.
So two things. Every time someone brings up the word pimp, all I can think of is a pimp named Slickback from the Boondocks, which is not related to anything we've talked about. But
well, I mean, it is a little bit. So the pimp named Slickback from the Boondocks. I mean, he's not selling slaves. His prostitutes are presumably free women in a post slavery society. But I mean, but the function of a pimp in in plays in Roman comedy is very similar. Um, Pimps are supposed to be the term leno, which we translate as pimp, is like a slave merchant generally, but in Roman comedy they're usually not like selling other slaves. It's basically just prostitutes. So
And the
so
other thing,
really it's not that different actually.
the
Just
other thing
there's certain cultural associations that maybe aren't quite the same, but it's sort of in the same vein.
the other thing I was thinking was, so I know I mentioned Diderot at the beginning. I didn't know we were going to talk as much about Diderot in this episode, but here we are. Um, his like idea of what drama should be does sound similar to Terence's in a way, if I understand it, like domestic disputes as drama. Diderot was also reacting against, so with like classic neoclassical verse dramas, like the characters didn't speak in like plain speak; they spoke in like Alexandrian couplets. So Diderot didn't like that. He didn't like uh, 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 neoclassical verse dramas also focused on like nobility or kings or historical figures, like supposedly important people and not like the masses. And Diderot was like,
Yeah.
no, we should have dramas that focus on everyday people. So in some ways, it does sound like the path that Diderot was going with the drama is reminiscent of some ancient comedy, actually, which
It's
makes
probably
sense
not.
given his classical education.
I was going to say it's probably not an accident. Terence, the reason that we have a good amount of Terence's work, like percentage wise, we have more Plautus, but Plautus wrote a absolute ton of plays, and Terence didn't live long enough to write that many. He died at like 32, I think, pretty young. But the reason we have so much of his work is he was used for school books throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. Really, even into the like 19th century. It's relatively recent, historically speaking, that he's fallen out of favor. Um, Usually, the reason being kind of what I was talking about earlier. His portrayal of like human interaction, like his language is very it's just very good. It's very well written. He had a real knack for represent, in spite of it still being poetical, representing human speech in a way that basically none of his contemporaries did.
Oh, yeah, and I think it's pretty. I think nowadays, I don't know. We look at like even like I guess potentially a Shakespeare play, but we look at the dramas that are very, very rigid with like how dialogue has to be written.
Mm-hmm.
And not to say these are bad writers like Moliere or Corneille Racine or something, but it seems a bit stilted. Like it seems a bit phony. You know,
I
it's hard.
agree. Yeah,
Like
I mean,
nowadays we're used to like dialogue being a recreation, like close to a recreation of human speech. And so I guess I mean just changes in time and fashion, but
right. I mean, I'm going to agree with that. I'm more of a Platonist myself. Terence is, again, as I get older, I appreciate his language. It's very uncommon in Latin literature to see someone so talented at just like representing like humans interacting. So much of what we know about like tendencies in spoken Latin really comes from him. Um, and somewhat to Plautus as well, but quite a bit less. Plautus is very silly, very wacky, lets his characters say things that no human would ever even imaginably say. Some of it was probably extremely confusing to hear spoken as well for all kinds of reasons. But yeah, whereas Terence, I struggle to imagine any Roman in the audience almost ever not understanding what characters are saying. Like, it all makes very good sense. So yeah,
alrighty. Well, we've been going on for almost 2 hours now, so we should probably leave it there.
Sure.
That'll
Yeah.
be we can touch back on ancient comedy in future episodes. Clearly, there's a lot of material to talk about. So
Yes.
I don't know if there's any closing thoughts you have, but
No, no, I think that pretty much covers it for now.
read Latin, folks.
Do you know, if you're I gotta say, I got a lot better at reading Latin from reading the comedians, and especially Terrence. They're so good at like just getting you like a grasp of how things are supposed to sound, and when things don't sound like that, it sticks out to you more, which is very important because Roman authors write things really weirdly on purpose.
And on that note, so thank you for listening, everyone. And we will have a new episode sometime next week. We never decide really in advance. Well, we decide in advance, but like a few days before usually. So, all right. Well, take care, everyone.
Walete.